If January 2026 were to be remembered by future historians as the real beginning of a new world order, it would not be because a single treaty was signed, a single empire collapsed, or a single war erupted, but because the accumulated tensions of the early 21st century finally crossed a threshold beyond which reversal was no longer possible. By that moment, the international system would not have dramatically changed overnight. It would have become unmistakably clear that the old assumptions guiding global power relations had expired. The liberal international order, long weakened but rhetorically preserved, would no longer even pretend to be universal. What emerged instead was not chaos, but a harsher, colder structure governed less by shared norms than by leverage, resilience, and controlled disruption. January 2026 would symbolize the point at which states, institutions, and societies collectively adjusted their behavior to a world defined not by stability, but by permanent strategic uncertainty. The roots of this transformation would stretch back decades to the unfulfilled promises of the post-Cold War era, when globalization was assumed to be irreversible and economic interdependence was expected to neutralize geopolitical rivalry. That assumption collapsed gradually, then suddenly. By the mid-2020s, trade had become a weapon, supply chains a vulnerability, and economic openness a strategic risk rather than a virtue. Sanctions, export controls, and financial exclusion were no longer exceptional measures, but routine instruments of statecraft. January 2026 would mark the moment when this reality ceased to be debated and became fully internalized. Governments no longer asked whether decoupling was desirable, only how far and how fast it could be managed without destabilizing their own societies. At the center of this shift stood the United States, still the most powerful actor in the system, but no longer able to shape outcomes through dominance alone. American power in 2026 would remain unmatched militarily and technologically, yet constrained by internal polarization, debt, demographic pressures, and a strategic environment saturated with competitors capable of imposing costs without direct confrontation. Washington's alliances would still exist, but they would function less as instruments of shared vision than as platforms for burden sharing and risk distribution. Deterrence would not be about preventing conflict entirely, but about ensuring that escalation remained controllable. January 2026 would represent the point at which the United States fully accepted that primacy no longer meant predictability. China, by contrast, would enter this new phase with clarity rather than illusion. The narrative of peaceful rise would have given way to an openly transactional posture rooted in power projection, economic leverage, and technological standard setting. Beijing would not seek to replace the global system wholesale, but to reshape it selectively, ensuring that in critical regions and sectors, its preferences were unavoidable. In East Asia, military pressure would coexist with economic dependency, creating a strategic environment in which neighbors were neither fully aligned nor fully autonomous. January 2026 would symbolize China's transition from patient challenger to structural architect of an alternative order, not ideological in nature, but operational in effect. That Russia's role in this emerging order would be paradoxical. Militarily degraded, yet politically defiant, economically constrained, yet strategically disruptive, Moscow would operate as a spoiler rather than a leader. Its influence would derive less from attraction than from its capacity to generate instability at relatively low cost. Cyber operations, disinformation, energy leverage, and asymmetric alliances would remain its primary tools. By January 2026, Russia would no longer be perceived as a declining power waiting for reintegration, but as a permanent source of friction embedded into the system itself, tolerated where useful, contained where dangerous, but never fully neutralized. Europe, often described as the missing power in global geopolitics, would find itself facing a decisive moment. The illusion that economic integration alone could guarantee security would have collapsed. Defense spending would rise, strategic language would harden, and autonomy would become a recurring theme, yet political fragmentation would persist. January 2026 would not mark Europe's arrival as a unified geopolitical actor, but rather its reluctant awakening to the costs of dependence. The European Union would increasingly function as a regulatory and economic bloc in a world where regulation itself had become a form of power, even as its military credibility lagged behind its ambitions. Beyond the traditional centers of power, the Global South would emerge not as a unified bloc, but as a strategic battleground of influence, negotiation, and selective alignment. Countries in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia would resist binary choices, extracting concessions from competing powers while preserving room for maneuver. January 2026 would reflect the consolidation of this posture. Non-alignment not as ideology, but as strategy. Infrastructure deals, security partnerships, and diplomatic support would be traded pragmatically, with little concern for moral narratives imposed from outside. What truly distinguishes this new world order is not the redistribution of power alone, but the transformation of conflict itself. Warfare would no longer be confined to battlefields or even states. Information, finance, energy, migration, and technology would all function as domains of confrontation. Artificial intelligence would accelerate decision-making while increasing the risk of miscalculation. Surveillance capabilities would expand state control while eroding privacy. Digital currencies and payment systems would fragment the financial system into competing spheres of influence. By January 2026, these tools would no longer be experimental. They would be institutionalized, embedded into national security doctrines and economic planning. International institutions would still exist, but their role would change fundamentally. The United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and similar bodies would increasingly serve as arenas of contestation rather than enforcement. Rules would matter, but only when backed by power. Legitimacy would be claimed through participation rather than compliance. January 2026 would mark the normalization of this gap between principle and practice, where the language of international law persists even as its application becomes selective. In this emerging order, stability would no longer mean the absence of conflict, but the ability to manage overlapping crises without systemic collapse. Escalation control would become the central obsession of strategists, replacing the older goal of conflict prevention. Diplomacy would be less about consensus building and more about signaling, red lines, and calibrated ambiguity. Trust would be scarce, verification imperfect, and misperception a constant risk. Yet the system would function, not because it is just, but because all major actors understand the cost of total breakdown. That if January 2026 were to stand as a historical marker, it would be because it represents the moment when the world stopped operating under inherited assumptions and began acting according to a new, unspoken consensus. That power is fragmented, rules are conditional, and security is provisional. The New World Order would not be announced, celebrated, or formalized. It would simply be lived day after day through decisions made under pressure, alliances formed without illusion, and conflicts managed without resolution. History would not remember January 2026 as the start of something entirely new, but as the point at which denial finally ended.